Reflections, The Last Days in Modernity, Part 2. Excerpts from Biblical Critical Theory, How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture, by Christopher Watkin. The twin coordinates of the individual and the universal set the course of modernity, including its eventual embrace of the secular. In fact, the secular itself is a profoundly Christian idea. In a secular age, Charles Taylor draws a distinction between the myth of the secular cultivated by modernity and a more complex picture that he takes to be closer to reality. Modernity's misleading myth about its own origins is the subtraction story, according to which modern society became secular by systematically threshing away the husk of religion and superstition that encased it, a husk that is uniquely irrational among views of the world. This leaves behind the pure, whole, and irreducible seed of instrumental rationality, negative freedom, and individualism. According to this story, all that needs to happen for secularization to occur is to get rid of the religious, casting off our false prejudices to reveal beneath them a normal, unimpeded view of the world. For Taylor, this subtraction story is problematic on at least two accounts. First, it is an emancipation story freeing the West from its benighted, superstitious path, and as we saw in relation to the Exodus narrative, the emancipation narrative of modernity has deep biblical roots. Second, the subtraction story assumes that post-Enlightenment Western irrationality and individualism are the true north to which all cultures will quite naturally return when they disabuse themselves of their prejudices. Underneath our silly cultural particularities, we are all modern white rational bourgeoisie males, really. This subtraction story is often framed as part of the secularization thesis, the reading of history according to which the West is becoming less and less religious over time, with other areas of the world set to follow the West's glorious lead according to some sort of reinvented theory of the white man's burden. But Taylor argues that this is simply not how secularization works. What it fails to contemplate is that Western modernity is not the simple residue left over when all artificial visions of the good have been expunged, but in fact, it has its own positive vision of the good. Michael Sandel takes up the question of this missing good and makes the argument that it is both impossible and undesirable to maintain that Western modernity has no positive vision of the good. Modern theories of justice, he notes, try to separate questions of fairness and rights from arguments about honor, virtue, and moral desert, leaving people to choose their own goods and ends. He traces this feature of modern society back to the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant and the 20th century liberal political theorist John Rawls. For Rawls, freely choosing selves should not be constrained by any particular vision of the good life. They should decide it for themselves. In fact, Rawls thought that the only way to find the common good in society was to leave all positive visions of the good, or what he called comprehensive doctrines, at the door. Religion is like a candy wrapper that you can easily throw away, he thought, leaving behind the tasty treat of secular public reason. Reason produces consensus. Religious conviction produces division. Reason is public. Religious conviction is private. Despite these attempts to have done with religion in the public square, Sandel argues that secular modernity, just as much as Christianity, carries a positive vision of the good life. He seeks to illustrate his point with what may first seem a rather left-field example. The claim by professional golfer Casey Martin, heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2001, that because of a disability from which he suffers, he should be allowed to use a golf cart when he competes in tournaments, on the basis that this would give him an equal opportunity to compete with able-bodied golfers. Sandel explains that Casey's petition received a negative reception among the golfing fraternity because the honor and recognition accorded great golfers depends on their sport being seen as a physically demanding athletic competition, and If the game at which they excel can be played while riding in a cart, their recognition as athletes could be questioned or diminished. Here is Sandel's conclusion. Whoever is right about the essential nature of golf, the federal case over Casey Martin's cart offers a vivid illustration of Aristotle's theory of justice. Debates about justice and rights are often, unavoidably, debates about the purpose of social institutions, the goods they allocate, and the virtues they honor and reward. Despite our best attempts to make law neutral on such questions, it may not be possible to say what's just without arguing about the nature of the good life. Sandel shows that the idea of a justice that is neutral with respect to the question of the good life requires a particular anthropology, namely that persons are freely choosing selves, unbound by prior moral ties. It is this underlying anthropology with which he takes issue, drawing on Alasdair MacIntyre's work on the narrative nature of identity. To answer the question, "Who am I?" is to ask a prior question. Of what stories do I find myself a part? The problem here, for the Rawlsian or Kantian liberal, is that all stories have some end in sight. In Sandel's terms, they have a theological character. So the concept of people as freely willing and choosing beings is inadequate. Moral deliberation is more about interpreting my life story than exerting my will. It involves choice, but the choice issues from the interpretation. It is not a sovereign act of will. These figures of instrumental rationality, freely choosing selves, and a supposed neutrality about the good life all shape a vision of the good just as well defined as the Christian figures of faith, the creation, fall, redemption story of humanity, and the good of God's glory. The ideology of the secular public square depends on one very particular understanding of the human being that privileges the capacity to make decisions and abstracts the capacity from the stories that give those decisions meaning. Sandel warns that deciding important public questions while pretending to a neutrality that cannot be achieved is a recipe for backlash and resentment, and is also an open invitation to narrow, intolerant moralisms. The neutrality of the naked public square, like the neutrality of the secular, is nothing of the sort. It insists upon one particular anthropology and, in seeking to exclude all discussion of the good life from public debate, ends up promoting one particular vision of the good life, namely, the good of the individual autonomy. It is a myth concealed by its hegemony. It has become common to point out that the secularization thesis has failed. The most famous witness testifying to its demise is sociologist Peter Berger, one of its most prominent early proponents, from confidently affirming in 1968 that, by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. Berger later revised his opinion and argued that the world today, with some exceptions, is as furiously religious as it ever was. The secularization thesis made the mistake of equating religion with church-going and took a very Western-centric view of the world, leading it dramatically to overestimate the decline of religious sentiments and moral intuitions. But it is one thing to say that the secularization thesis has failed, and quite another to suggest that might in fact have happened. Charles Taylor holds to a disenchantment thesis. The gods have been banished from the modern world, leaving behind a mechanistic and immanent view of reality. But for other thinkers, with whom I tend to agree, this does not quite capture the subtlety of what has happened to religious figures in modernity. In contrast to both the subtraction story and the disenchantment thesis, William Cavanaugh and others advance a migration paradigm. Religious and theological ideas have not been threshed away from society, nor have they been abandoned in a general disenchantment. They have merely migrated within society, moving away from God and attaching themselves to other ideas and institutions, primarily the nation-state, where their influence is still profound. Whereas Taylor argues that the modern world is disenchanted, Kavanaugh sees ghosts everywhere. What we mistake for secularization is religion going undercover, assuming disguises that make it harder to spot, but just as influential as ever. The migration thesis evokes a society and culture that still live in the shadow of the faith and have lost the light of the faith, where religion did not disappear in a puff of secularization and return with the hey presto of the post-secular, for the very good reason that it quite simply never went away. For the migration thesis, secular late modernity relates to Christianity neither as an antithesis nor as a carbon copy, but as a parody. The city is a poor imitation of heavenly community, the modern state, a deformed version of the ecclesia, the market, a distortion of consummation, modern entertainment, a caricature of joy, schooling, a misrepresentation of true formation, liberalism, a crash simulacrum of freedom, and the sovereignty we accord to the self, a parody of God himself. What all these instances of migration share is a desire to appropriate the goods and benefits of God while ignoring and excluding God himself, a move I have called imitative atheism. The important task in this context is to identify and analyze these migrations of the holy in society, and thereby understand how, in the language of Acts 17, we are still very religious, despite ourselves. Kavanaugh's argument has two levels, a weak and a strong migration thesis. The weak thesis is that the nation happens to behave just like a deity. The strong thesis is that it could never behave that way at all if theology had not created and given meaning to the categories it deploys.
Put on the full armor of God. Stand firm against the left's schemes. You will face flaming arrows, but if you have the shield of faith, you will overcome them. But I can tell you this, I have only begun to fight.
Faith in the nation, the market, and secular Western values takes on the status of a religious conviction, and instead of proselytizing the heathen by sending missionaries, we now tie foreign aid to human rights, social and often economic reforms in foreign nations, seeking to remake them in our image. From time to time, we launch a crusade to bring democracy to a nation not yet blessed with our system of government. Our zeal to spread our values has all the characteristics of fundamentalism, the assumption of a static essence, knowable immediately, of each civilization, the ability to ignore history and tradition, and the desire to lead the ideological battle. As sociologist Bruno Latour rightly comments, if we want to translate into today's vocabulary what we used to talk about as the Word of God, we need to look at market consumerism. But there is a catch to the migration thesis. Religious ideas never fit snugly within the market and the nation state. If liberal modernity draws heavily on Christian ideas, it uses them not as a native speaker, but as one reading the words of a foreign language out loud, that is to say, in a faltering, staccato, uncomprehending way, mangling a good deal of the pronunciation. As Chesterton says, the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad, because they are isolated from each other and wandering alone. For example, the nation-state tries to secure unity amid a plurality of visions of the good by subsuming everything under a single alliance to the nation. You can be Christian, Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, or whatever else you like, as long as you put loyalty to your nation first. This mimics the city of God, in which the city's unity is found in a shared love of God. But the nation is like a mirror in the sky, reflecting us back to ourselves, and we are left with no greater authority than our own to check our pride or self-sufficiency. We have put an image of ourselves in the sky, and now we obediently worship the heavenly apparition. God, by contrast, is other. He is not us. He is not a mirror in the sky reflecting us back to ourselves. He is a window showing us something beyond ourselves. He rebukes our pride and never quite conforms to our idea of how he should be. In short, he constantly surprises and wrongfoots us in a way that a nation-state of our own making cannot. What is more, for Augustine, there are always two cities, the city of God and the earthly city, intertwined with each other, whereas for the nation-state, there is only one monolithic, exhaustive, self-contained, and self-justifying city. Kavanaugh's migration thesis was a venerable genealogy of its own. The prominent theorist of secularization Karl Lowith argued as early as 1949 that modernity was the continuation of Christian ideals under other names. And the influential but controversial Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt argued in 1922, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts not only because of their historical development in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure. Schmitt's point is not simply that secular modernity came after Christianity and borrowed some of its ideas here and there, not simply that the biblical God becomes the mortal God of Hobbes' Leviathan, but that as a system as a whole, it functions like a religion. Modernity's relationship to theology is not like building a new form of locomotion using only a wheel and pedals from an existing car. It is like taking the whole car with all of its interrelated parts, painting it a different color, and passing it off as a new form of transport. Secularism hasn't only picked Christianity's pockets, it has also picked Christianity's brains. Indeed, the migration thesis, mutatis mutandis, goes back through Augustine to the Bible itself. The question for Augustine is not whether God will be worshipped in society, but which God will be worshipped. And Paul warns that when people turn away from the immortal God, they do not worship nothing, but turn to worship elements and objects within creation. Romans 1:23. The theological saturation of modernity is also acknowledged by many secular philosophers. Nietzsche sets himself against the theologians and whatever has theologians' blood in its veins, adding that this includes the whole of our philosophy. And Michel Foucault holds that the 16th century is not characterized by the beginning of de-Christianization, but rather, as a number of historians have shown, by a phase of in-depth Christianization. Religious ideas and practices have migrated and proliferated, Foucault argues, not disappeared.
Confession is nerve-wracking. I know because I feel it myself, and I try to go every single week.
One of the leading examples is the practice of confession, understood as speaking one's private desires to God or to a human confessor in order to both understand oneself better and shape one's future conduct. For Foucault, confession has migrated in late modernity from a religious context into all corners of society. Confession has spread its effects far and wide. It plays a part in justice, medicine, education, family relationships, and love relations in the most ordinary affairs of everyday life. And in the most solemn rites, one confesses one's crimes, one's sins, one's thoughts and desires, one's illnesses and troubles. One goes about telling with the greatest precision whatever is most difficult to tell. The most defenseless tenderness and the bloodiest of powers have a similar need of confession. Western man has become a confessing animal. Sarah Mills muses that this precision of confession can be seen in a wide range of practices today, ranging from therapeutic counseling, testimonial autobiographical writing, and reality TV in gay and lesbian coming out. These confessors, to be sure, do not shepherd us on the road from sin to salvation. They lead us on a more worldly path of secular redemption to health, well-being, that is, sufficient wealth, standard of living, security, and protection against accidents. On Foucault's reading, and contrary to what most people assume, the sexual revolution of the 1960s was by no means a rejection of the religious but secularized practice of religious confession. A further migration is the sense of the sacred, which has by no means disappeared, argues Jacques Ellul, but has merely been chased out of nature and transferred into objects. We can begin to see what he means if we contemplate the latest iPhone billboard, presenting the hollowed gadget as a numinous object of veneration, like some late modern monstrance. In a brilliant piece of analysis, Ellul continues that we ourselves have not changed, because we still relate our sense of the sacred to what constitutes our environment. Just as we always have, what has changed is simply that the world we know now bears no relation to the human world which, up to half a century ago, seemed to be eternal. We have exchanged plows for phones and corn gods for Coca-Cola, but our determination to find the sacred in our surroundings has remained constant. The most interesting migration of all concerns the secular itself. Claiming to have chased religion from its home, the secular has moved in and kept all the furniture. The secular is built on the assumption that there are two domains, the religious and the secular, and that one can grow as the other shrinks. As Tom Holland points out, this is a thoroughly and deeply religious idea, reaching back to Augustine's notion of two cities. When secularism arrived on the scene, it came trailing incense clouds of meaning that were irrevocably and venerably Christian. And the very idea of secularism witnesses not the Christianity's decline, but to its seemingly infinite capacity for evolution. Furthermore, when secularism fights against religion, it does so with religion's own weapons, using Christian moral intuitions of universality, individuality, conscience, freedom, equality, and reciprocity to argue against the parochialism and oppression of the Church, and for a true universalism in which all individuals are respected and valued. It also inherits from Christianity an affirmation of ordinary life and the dignity of this world, leveraging it to jettison the supernatural altogether and make this worldly existence a self-sufficient reality, unaware of the irony of the migration thesis. The French sociologist Marcel Gauchet argues that Christianity is the religion for departing from religion, meaning that it is the religion that first creates the space of the secular that then, Zeus-like, attempts to kill its own father. Christianity proves to have been a religion for departing from religion. For this reason, Christianity remains the most relevant religion in a post-religious society, especially in Catholicism in Europe, where, as distinct from America, Christianity has taken a stand against the world that issued from it. Secularism also relies on an idea of linear time brought into the tradition by the Bible and refined by Augustine. The idea of historical progress from a benighted and superstitious past to an enlightened and rational present derives from the Christian idea of a meaningful arc of history progressing towards a discernible end. Time and again, the secular piggybacks on religion in order to outrun religion, vainly attempting, Lady Macbeth-like, to wash away the damn spot that stains not the surface of the skin, but the depths of the heart. The secularization we have is a very Christian secularization, not an alternative to religion, but a Christian heresy. This deep affinity between Christianity and the secular is sometimes easier to discern from outside a Western context. Indian historian S.N. Bangaladera writes, Christianity spreads in two ways, through conversion and through secularization. For Charles Taylor, late modern society is not less and less religious, it is more and more cross-pressured. We can think of the cross-pressured condition as having a weak and a strong version. The weak version is that neither I nor anyone else can assume that other members of society will think as I do about religion. The strong version is that everyone, religious and secular alike, is haunted by the possibility that they may be mistaken. The condition is captured brilliantly by Kirillov in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Demons. If Stavrogin believes, he does not believe that he believes. And if he does not believe, he does not believe he does not believe. Today, those who believe do not always believe that they believe, and those who do not believe do not always believe that they do not believe. Gone are the days of naive belief, and gone are the days of the naive unbelief. Already in 1946, C.S. Lewis was writing that only freshmen now talk as if the anti-Christian position were self-evident. The days of simple unfaith are as dead as those of simple faith. Everyone is fragilized, not completely secure in our beliefs. In the words of Paul Elie, we are all skeptics now. Our journey through late modernity in part 1 and 2 of this video series has been complex. We have seen that Christianity is substantially responsible for the birth of the nation-state, but the nation-state seeks to extinguish the power of the church. We have seen that the secular is deeply Christian, but it sets itself up in opposition to Christianity. Is modernity fundamentally Christian or fundamentally anti-Christian? Are its values, freedom, individuality, conscience, and equality Christian or anti-Christian? It should by now be clear that no single word response can be adequate. Modernity is a Christian heresy, and heresy is neither unrelated to orthodoxy nor just the same as orthodoxy. To live as a Christian in the last days of late modernity is to live amidst the hegemonic cultural heresy, neither utterly alien to the faith nor a faithful continuation of it. The situation demands of Christians a subtlety and discernment perhaps unprecedented in the history of the Church. Historically speaking, our situation is both familiar and novel. It is familiar because as the overt presence of Christianity fades in society, we are returning to the position occupied by Christians in the late Roman Empire, a marginal minority viewed with suspicion and considered a danger to social cohesion. We are all in the Roman Empire now. But there is also a very great difference between Christians of the first century and their brothers and sisters in the 21st, namely that late modern society is soaked, steeped, and cast-aged in Christian moral intuitions, Christian notions of transcendence, and a Christian view of time. This leaves Christians in a particular situation, marginal on the surface, but central to society's undercurrents of consensus. Christian figures are tacitly assumed and explicitly rejected by our media, politicians, and business leaders. And what is more, Christianity provides the very ethical architecture by virtue of which it is rejected. It is as if our society itself has become cross-pressured. It cannot reject Christianity without affirming its Christian moral intuitions, and it cannot affirm its Christian values without corrupting them in a nation-state and market that fail to substitute for a transcendent, loving God. Many approaches to Christian cultural engagement grasp one of these two realities. As Oliver O'Donovan characterizes it, those on the left tend to emphasize the similarity of late modernity to first-century Christianity, insisting that the church must be alien, revolutionary, against the cultural grain. By contrast, those on the right tend to stress the Christian figures and values running through much of our late modern society, such as democracy, human rights, and freedom. Their disagreement is like that of the hapless Hindu theologians in John Gottfried Sachs' poem, The Wise Man and the Elephant. And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. Yes, our society is shot through with Christian values, and yes, Christians must be an alien, revolutionary presence in late modernity. The elephant has both a trunk and a tail. How should we describe this situation? We could do worse than conclude that ours is, in quite a technical sense, an ironic age. caught in the headlights of its own ignorance, like the authorities who thought they were having a little joke when they nailed to Christ's cross the sign, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." In seeking to amputate what it thought was the gangrenous limb of religion, modernity has in fact been sawing off the branch it is sitting on. This complex context lends the Church in the last days of late modernity both a conservative and a subversive dynamic. It is conservative insofar as the moral intuitions of our society are still largely Christian, and it is subversive insofar as those intuitions have been decontextualized, isolated, and inappropriately deployed. To live in the last days is to live in a series of overlaps and tensions between the now and the not yet, between the in and the not of, between giving to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, all within the culture that thinks it is rejecting Christianity at the very moment it affirms its deep and irreducible debt to Christian figures.